I am 77 years old, and I came outside that morning in my house slippers to find 18 inches of raw wood where the magnolia had been. Not a tree, a stump, a circle of pale heartwood, open to the October sky, already beginning to dry at the edges, the way cut wood does when it has been separated from its roots too quickly. I stood next to it for a long time without moving. I had watched that tree bloom every March for 41 years. 10 days of white-pink flowers every spring, reliable as the calendar. My husband Warren planted it the year our daughter Renee was born, carried the sapling home from a nursery in Stone Mountain wrapped in a damp towel, and the two of them, the tree and the girl, had grown up in this yard together. Behind me, a crew was loading the last of the brush into a truck parked in the alley. My son Derek was standing near the garage in a pair of new work gloves, looking pleased with himself. I did not speak to him. I went back inside, put on the kettle, and called my attorney. Welcome, friends. A 52-year-old tree her husband planted, cut down while she slept, for a parking spot. If that doesn't sit wrong in your chest, I don't know what will. Stay with us. Loretta's story is one you need to hear from start to finish. I want to tell you about what was in that garden before I tell you about what was taken from it, because the taking only means something if you understand the weight of what was there. A person who does not know what a Magnolia exulangiana costs in time and patience might hear the word tree and picture any tree. I need you to understand what kind of tree this was. I taught botany at Sequoia High School for 31 years, not biology, botany specifically, the science of plant structures, root systems, the way a tree stores energy in its cambium layer through an entire winter, and releases it all at once in a single week of March warmth. I retired in 2011, and the years since have been spent doing what I did during every spring break and summer vacation I had as a working teacher, tending this garden with the methodical attention I brought to 30 years of lesson plans. Eunice Darden, my neighbor and oldest friend, has lived next door for 31 years and has called my back garden the most deliberate half-acre in DeKalb County for as long as I can remember. She means it as a compliment. She also means it as a gentle, accurate observation about my character. The back garden was mine, the way only things you have built over 4 decades from nothing can be yours, not decorative, intentional. The saucer magnolia in the southeast corner, Magnolia exulangiana if you want the Latin, was Warren's contribution, the only tree he ever planted here. He was not a gardening man. He was an electrician who smelled like solder and read Louis L'Amour paperbacks and called everything I grew the green things, with affection and complete indifference to their names. But the spring Renee was born, he came home from Stone Mountain with that sapling wrapped in a damp towel and announced he wanted to plant something that would still be here when she was grown. We put it in the ground together on a Saturday afternoon in April 1973. He held the root ball while I backfilled the soil, tamped it down, watered it slowly, and it bloomed for the first time 4 years later, 7 pale cups opening at once, white shading to pink at the edges. Warren stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and said, I guess it worked. That was his complete assessment of the event, and I loved it. The 2 river birches along the east fence I had grown from cuttings taken from a specimen at the Atlanta Botanical Garden in 1994. I was a member of their propagation program, which is open to educators, and I had asked about the birches specifically because Betula nigra is a patient tree, and I wanted patient trees. The cuttings took 3 full years to establish enough root mass to thrive independently. I watered them every other day through the drought summer of 1995, dragging a hose from the back spigot at 6 in the morning before the heat set in. They had reached 40 feet by last October. I had watched them get there inch by inch over 30 years, tracking their growth against the fence line the way a parent marks a child's height on a doorframe. The fact that I know exactly how tall they were when they were cut down is not sentiment. It is information I happen to have, the way a botanist has information, because I was paying attention. The persimmon, Diosporos virginiana, native, was the most demanding. Native persimmon is not an ornamental tree. It does not perform for you. It sits quietly for years, growing its root system underground while you stand over it, wondering if you planted a stick, and then one autumn, it fruits for the first time, and you understand that it was working the entire time, underground, invisibly, in its own schedule. I planted mine in the spring of 1998. I waited 11 years for the first fruit. By the time Derek's crew cut it down, it was in its third year of peak production. The persimmons were dense and dark gold in October, the kind of fruit a Diosporos virginiana produces when it has fully matured, when the tannins have converted and the flesh has gone soft and sweet. It would have fruited reliably for another 20 years at least if it had been left to do so. Some things don't grow back. Not at the same rate, not in the same lifetime. That is not a grievance. That is plant science. The Natchez crepe myrtles along the back fence, 6 of them in a row, Lagerstroemia indica ex Fourier, white flowering. I had started from bare root in 2003. They had reached 20 feet and developed the characteristic exfoliating bark that takes a crepe myrtle 15 or more years to show. Cinnamon brown, peeling in long, papery strips, the texture of parchment. I used to cut a few branches each July and put them in a tall vase on the kitchen counter. The blooms smell like very little, which I have always found restful. They do not announce themselves. This is what was in that garden. I am telling you because I want you to understand that when I stood in my house slippers and looked at what my son had done, I was not simply experiencing loss in some general sense. I was conducting an involuntary inventory, the way a teacher grades, item by item, precise, without any capacity to round down. The kind of accounting you do when you know exactly what each thing cost and exactly how long each thing took, and the numbers in both columns are specific and will not blur. Derek moved back to the Atlanta area 18 months ago, after his divorce from Renata was finalized. He is 49 years old and works in logistics management for a distribution company in Doraville. Competent work, a steady salary, the kind of job that requires him to be organized and precise from 9 to 5, and apparently exempts him from applying those qualities anywhere else. He and Renata had been living in Chattanooga for 11 years. I had grown accustomed to the distance, and I want to be honest about that. The distance had been comfortable for both of us in different ways, and when he called to say he was coming back to Atlanta, I felt genuine warmth and also something smaller and quieter that I chose to ignore. He found an apartment in Decatur, 12 minutes from this house. He began coming to Sunday dinners. I want to say clearly that this was pleasant. I have been cooking Sunday dinners alone for 9 years, and having someone to cook for was not a hardship. It was something I had missed. He would arrive around 2 in the afternoon, sometimes with a bottle of wine he knew I would not drink, occasionally with a bakery pie from a shop on Commerce Drive. Peach in summer, apple in fall, always a shade too sweet, always chosen with the effort of a man who is trying but not quite close enough to the target. I told him once I preferred tart over sweet. He brought the same pie the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. Not stubbornness, inattention. The first request came in October. 6 weeks after he settled in. His car, a 2018 Nissan Sentra that had been making a noise since before the divorce, needed a repair he could not cover that month because he had paid a double deposit on the apartment, and the timing had been bad. He asked for $900. He would pay it back by December. I wrote the check the same afternoon. I logged it in the small green ledger I keep in the top drawer of my desk, the one I have used for every household expense since Warren died, because a teacher on a pension learns early to keep records, or she does not stay ahead. The entry said, October 14th, Derek, car repair, $900. I did not ask for a promissory note because he was my son, and it did not occur to me at that point that I should. December came and went. Derek did not mention the $900. Neither did I. I want to be precise about what that silence was, because I have thought about it many times since. I did not ask because I did not want to make him feel bad, which is true, but that is not the full truth. The full truth is that asking would have required me to acknowledge that I had been waiting for the mention of it, which would have required me to examine why I was waiting, which would have required me to see something I was not yet ready to see about the shape of what was happening. A botanist recognizes a pattern in a root system before she names it. I was recognizing. I was not naming yet. He brought me a potted fern for my birthday that month. A Boston fern, Nephrolepis exaltata, full and healthy, the kind that overwinters well indoors in Georgia. He set it on the kitchen counter with a small ribbon and said, "Happy birthday, Mom." My birthday is in April. December is not April. I thanked him and moved the fern to the window, and as he was leaving, I noticed that he seemed genuinely pleased with himself, the way a person looks when they believe they have done something thoughtful, which told me something I found harder to hold than his forgetting. He did not know. That was the harder part. I should tell you about Gina Holst, because she is part of this story, and because fairness requires me to describe her accurately, and accuracy requires some effort on my part. She is 38 years old. She met Derek at a work event sometime last spring. By June, she had moved in with him. I know this because Derek mentioned it the way you mention a change in commute schedule. "Oh, Gina's staying with me now." Over the phone. Not at Sunday dinner, not face-to-face, as if the information didn't warrant a deliberate conversation. I met her in July when they came to the house together. She has dark hair she keeps in a low ponytail, and the kind of unhurried confidence I recognize in people who have already privately decided where things are heading and are simply waiting for external reality to catch up. She was not unkind to me. I want to be clear about that. She asked about the garden, which most people do not bother to do, and when I told her about the persimmon, 11 years before first fruit, she looked at it with what appeared to be genuine interest and said, "That's a remarkable amount of patience." I thought, at the time, that I liked her. She has a habit I noticed from the first visit. She walks through a space the way some people walk through an estate sale, assessing, mentally repositioning, identifying what she would move or change. She does it out loud, as though it is a form of conversation rather than a private editorial. She stood in my kitchen doorway that first afternoon and said, "You could really open this up if you took the wall between here and the dining room." She was architecturally correct. I have no interest in opening it up. I said, "I know," and moved on, and she seemed to accept this without offense and without entirely dropping the assessment. Derek brought her to Sunday dinners most weeks after that. I cooked for 3 instead of 2, and I did not mind this. What I minded was smaller and harder to name. The way Gina would arrive and begin, immediately and unconsciously, rearranging things, shifting the salt and pepper to a different position on the counter, straightening the dish towels on the oven handle, tilting the framed print in the hallway to what she apparently judged to be a better angle. She never asked. She did not appear to notice she was doing it. I would spend Monday morning quietly returning everything to where it belonged, the way you reset a room after it has been used by someone who did not grow up in it. In November, Derek called to ask if he could borrow money for a car. Not a repair this time. A new car, a 2022 Hyundai Tucson he had found at a dealer in Smyrna. Silver, very clean, low miles. He needed $18,000. He would pay it back, same as the 900. He said it in exactly the same tone as the 900. Sincere, confident, with no particular plan behind the confidence. I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about the 900, still unmentioned in the ledger. I thought about the fact that Derek was 49 years old with a steady job. I thought about the fact that I could not explain to myself, rationally, why I was going to write this check. Then I wrote it, because he was my son, and because I was still, at that point, telling myself that the sum of all of this was temporary. The ledger entry read, November 3rd, Derek, car purchase, $18,000. No promissory note. I wrote that last part, no promissory note, in my own small, careful hand, and I sat looking at it for a moment before I closed the book. A bookkeeper would have had the note on the same day, before the ink on the check was dry. My father had kept a ledger like this one, the same kind of green cloth cover book from the office supply store. And he used to say that writing a number down was the first step toward understanding what it meant. He had been a man who ran a small hardware store for 40 years on that principle, and he never once lent money without a signature and a repayment date. I had been a teacher for 31 years, and I had kept meticulous lesson plans and attendance records and field trip permissions signed in triplicate, and I had written those 4 words to myself, no promissory note, like a teacher leaving a comment on her own work. Incomplete. Revise before resubmitting. I did not revise. I closed the ledger and put it back in the top desk drawer and told myself it was still a loan in the sense that I still believed it was a loan, which is a distinction I understand now was doing a great deal of weight-bearing work that it was not structurally equipped to carry. The mind is an efficient machine for maintaining beliefs that cost less than their alternatives. I was 76 years old, and I had been a careful person my whole life, and I was choosing, that November evening, to be less careful than I knew how to be. I closed the drawer. I went to the kitchen and put on the kettle. Outside, the magnolia stood in the dark of the yard, its crown above the roofline, patient and entirely unaware of any of it. The Tucson was silver because Gina had chosen silver. Derek drove it to Sunday dinner the following week, looking the way men look when they have a new car, and things seemed to be coming together. He walked me around it in the driveway, showed me the heated seats, the backup camera, the way the hatch opened automatically when you stood close enough with the key fob. It was a fine car, and I said so. He had his own key to the house, had always had a key, and within a month he was driving the Tucson more than his Nissan, using the Tucson's key as a general-purpose entry to my day. Tuesday evenings, Saturday mornings when Gina wanted to visit the farmer's market in Avondale Estates, Sunday afternoons when it was more convenient than arranging his own transportation for the day. The Nissan sat in the lot outside his apartment, gradually accumulating pollen. I drove my 2016 Camry and I did not raise the subject. Spring came. In March, the magnolia bloomed the way it always did. 10 days exactly. The white pink cups open all at once, the petals dropping in a ring around the trunk on the 11th day, the leaves emerging in their place. I stood at the kitchen window every morning that week with my coffee, the way I had stood every March for 41 years, watching it. Warren had been dead for 9 years, and I still thought of him when it bloomed. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular ongoing presence of a person whose absence you have learned to live beside rather than get over. The magnolia was his. That is what it was. In April, my actual birthday, which Derek did not acknowledge, not even a phone call, I discovered 2 charges on my grocery account that I had not made. $34.17 at a Kroger on Commerce Drive on a Thursday afternoon. $41.55 at the same location 8 days later. Derek's name was on the account as an emergency contact, a designation I had set up years ago when I had a health scare and he was living in Chattanooga and I wanted someone accessible if something happened. The emergency contact had apparently translated in the intervening years to purchasing access. I did not know precisely how. I did not ask. I removed his access that afternoon, and I entered both charges in the green ledger under a line I wrote with particular care. Unexplained grocery charges, April, $75.72. I looked at that line for a moment. It seemed too small to constitute a confrontation, too small to explain why I had taken the trouble to write it down so carefully. Each individual entry in the ledger had that quality, small enough on its own to seem disproportionate to name. The $900. He'd had a rough month. The $18,000. It was a loan and he'd pay it back. The grocery charges. Probably a mistake. The fern in December. A thoughtful gesture if you didn't look at the calendar. But I had been a teacher for 31 years, and I had graded enough student work to know the difference between an isolated error and a pattern. Patterns have totals. I was not ready to add it up yet. But I was beginning to see the column. In May, 2 large plastic storage bins appeared in my garage. They were pushed against the back wall behind the metal shelving unit where I keep my clay pots, my bags of pine bark mulch and hollytone, and my collection of Felco pruners accumulated over 40 years of gardening. 6 pairs, because a good pair of pruners is worth repairing and keeping, and I have done so, and the Felco number 2 I bought in 1988 still cuts cleaner than anything I have bought since. The bins were sealed and labeled in blue marker, D. Pruitt, with the apartment address below. Derek mentioned them the following Sunday as a parenthetical, the way you mention that you moved a piece of furniture. "Oh, I left a couple boxes in your garage, just temporary while Gina's settling in, shouldn't be more than a few weeks." I said, "I see." He moved on to the Braves. Temporary, in this instance, meant 5 months and counting. By July, the 2 bins had become 6, stacked too high against my shelving unit in a configuration that required me to move my own supplies to the opposite wall to reach the things I needed. I did this without comment. I want to be accurate about what that silence was. It was not patience, and it was not generosity. It was a habit I had developed over a long time, the habit of making room, of adjusting, of deciding that the friction of a conversation was not worth the return. I had been doing this in small ways throughout Derek's adult life, and I had never examined it closely enough to see it clearly. I was beginning to examine it now. Gina came to the house on a Saturday afternoon in July while Derek was already there. She came in through the back gate, which she had recently begun using as her preferred entrance, and stood in the garden while I was weeding the persimmon bed. She had one of those tall plastic iced teacups with a straw from somewhere on the drive over, and she stood at the edge of the bed and looked at the back fence line the way she always looked, at spaces she was privately reconfiguring. "All this shade," she said, not precisely to me, more to the garden or to the air. "The crepe myrtles, the birches. You must not get much afternoon sun back here at all." I looked up from the weeding. "That's correct," I said. "I planted them for the shade." She nodded, as though I had offered a design choice worth reconsidering. "It's just, with all this space, if you had the light, you could do so much more back here." Then she went inside to find Derek, and I went back to the persimmon bed, and I noted her comment the way I noted all of it. Precisely, without drama, the way a botanist logs a condition that bears watching. In August, Derek said something I have thought about many times since. We were sitting on the back porch after Sunday dinner. Iced tea, the particular deadweight heat of an Atlanta August, the crepe myrtles blooming in their white clusters along the back fence, the persimmon heavy with unripe fruit, still 6 weeks from peak. Derek was in Warren's old green Adirondack chair, the one I had repainted 2 springs ago with a quart of Benjamin Moore I had been saving. He was looking at the garden with the unfocused gaze of a man whose attention is somewhere else entirely, and then he said, without any particular weight, "You know, Mom, this must be a lot to maintain at your age." I held my glass and looked at the persimmon tree. "All this watering," he continued, "the pruning, it's physical work and you're not. I just think about it sometimes, whether it's too much for you to be doing alone." I said, "I am aware of my age." He said, "I know, I worry." I said, "The garden has never been too much. It is the exact amount of work I choose to do." He did not press it. He refilled his iced tea, changed the subject to something about a project at work, and left an hour later, apparently having forgotten the exchange entirely. I had not forgotten it. I heard it for what it was. The first articulation of a case that was being built, not consciously. Derek does not operate with that kind of deliberateness, but systematically, in the way that people who have trained themselves to believe their convenience is your benefit will eventually begin to say so out loud. The garden was a lot of work. She was getting older. It would be so much less to manage. These were the steps of the argument, and he had put the first one down. That evening, I sat at my desk with the green ledger. October car repair, $900. November car purchase, $18,000. April grocery charges, $75.72. Storage unit rental. I had been paying $67 a month for Derek's storage unit on DeKalb Industrial Way since January, because he had asked in December when the Tucson purchase was recent, and I had not wanted another conversation that soon, and the storage unit had seemed, at the time, a manageable thing. 7 months, through July, $469. There was also the oil change in March, $340 for the Tucson's first service, which Derek had mentioned, and I had offered to cover without being asked, because he had seemed genuinely pleased with the car, and I had wanted to sustain that. That is the honest accounting of it. I had wanted things to go smoothly, and I had used money to make them go smoothly, and I had called it helping. The total in the column was $19,784.72. I looked at the number for a while. Not with shock. I had been keeping the ledger precisely because I had been watching this total assemble itself, one entry at a time, and I was a person who added columns accurately and did not look away from what the addition produced. What I felt looking at it was something closer to the particular exhaustion that comes at the end of a long day of work you did not plan to do. The tiredness not of having lifted too much, but of having been gradually redirected from something else for hours without noticing the redirection until the day was gone. There was also this. Every entry in the ledger represented a moment when I had made a choice. I had chosen to write the check in October. I had chosen not to ask about repayment in December. I had chosen not to raise the grocery charges. I had chosen to pay the storage unit rather than say anything about the bins. I had offered the oil change. Each individual choice had seemed in its moment either too small to contest or too reasonable to decline or too likely to cause friction to be worth it. The sum of all the moments was not small. The sum was nearly $20,000, and a garage I had reorganized around someone else's boxes, and a back porch conversation about my age, and the garden I had built over 40 years. I had participated in all of it. A woman who keeps accurate records has to keep accurate records about her own participation as well. I closed the ledger and put it in the top drawer and turned off the desk lamp. Outside, the yard was dark. The crepe myrtles along the fence, invisible in the October evening. In the southeast corner, the magnolia's crown was a darker shape against the dark sky, patient and entirely indifferent to the accounting I had just done. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. In the morning, I was in the garden before 6, in the damp early air, with my Felco number 2 and a bucket, and I worked until the light came fully up. And I did not think about the ledger, and I thought about the ledger constantly. Nearly $20,000, not one payment back. And then he sits in her chair and tells her the garden is a lot for her age. I have to ask, what would you have done in Loretta's place by the time that number landed? September arrived, and with it something I had been doing my best not to name. I have tended things for a long time. Gardens, students, a marriage, a household, a set of relationships I had invested decades in building. I know the difference between a plant that needs better conditions and a plant that is past the point where better conditions will help. That difference is real, and it requires clear looking, the kind of looking that does not allow you to see what you want to be there rather than what is actually there. A root system that has gone anaerobic does not recover from improved drainage. The damage has occurred at the cellular level. You can provide every correct condition going forward. What was damaged is still damaged. I had taught this to 16-year-olds for 31 years, and I understood it as science, not metaphor. And I had been declining to apply it to my own situation for the better part of a year. In September, I stopped declining. Some things don't grow back. That is the accurate statement. The botanical one. A frost-damaged root system may put out new growth in spring. It is not technically dead, but it will not be what it was, and treating it as though nothing has changed does not change what has changed. The new growth is real. The original plant is not recoverable. A woman who has spent her career understanding plants understands this without sentimentality. You look at what is in front of you and you name it accurately. I thought about Derek a great deal in September. Not with bitterness. That is not a register I have ever inhabited easily. With a specific sadness that comes from seeing clearly something you have been seeing partially for a long time, and understanding that the partial vision was a choice you made because you loved the thing and the love was real. The love was real, it was not the problem. It was also not, I understood now, a reason to keep not seeing. Derek had been taking what was available to him for 18 months and calling it help, and genuinely believing those were the same thing. He had moved into my garage, borrowed my car, charged my grocery account, accepted $18,000 without paperwork, and then sat in my husband's chair on my back porch and suggested that my garden was too much for a woman of my age. He had done all of this without malice. That is the part that requires the most honest handling, not malice. He had arranged his perspective so completely that his convenience and my well-being always pointed in the same direction, and he believed the arrangement, and he had believed it sincerely in every individual moment, while the sum of all the individual moments was becoming something I could no longer look at sideways. And I had participated. I want to say that clearly. I had written the checks. I had moved my supplies to the other wall. I had made Sunday dinners for 3 without being asked. I had done all of this out of something that was genuinely love, but was also something else. The long habit of a woman who has been making room for other people since before she can clearly remember, who learned early that maintaining peace was the same as maintaining love, and who had carried that equation through her whole adult life without ever examining it carefully enough to see that it wasn't quite right. I tended the garden that September, the way I always had. Early in the morning, before anyone else was awake, in the particular silence of Witherspoon Lane before 6 o'clock, when the light is low and the air still holds the cool from overnight. The persimmon was beginning to color. The crepe myrtles were finishing their 3rd bloom cycle of the season, the white flowers browning at the edges and dropping in the heat, the way they always did in late September. I pruned the lower branches of the birches, the ones that had begun to arc toward the fence, and I stood each morning at the kitchen window with my coffee and looked at the magnolia. It had finished its spring work and gone full green, the heavy, deep green of late summer that would persist until the first hard frost. I did not know, in September, that I was looking at it in its living form for the last time. Some things you only understand after. Eunice Darden called me on a Sunday evening in late September at 7:15. Eunice, Noonie to everyone who knows her well, has lived next door for 31 years. She is 74, a retired postal supervisor who ran the Decatur, Maine branch for 19 years, and before that was a route carrier, and knows every street in this zip code by heart, which is a thing she does not bring up, but which is simply part of how she moves through the world. She makes fig preserves in August from the tree in her backyard, puts them up in half-pint ball jars, and delivers them to a list of perhaps 12 people who have apparently earned the honor through sustained good behavior over multiple decades. I have been on the list for as long as I can remember. She is my oldest friend in the particular way that means she has observed things over 30 years and does not make a production of what she has seen. She called to tell me that she had watched Derek walk the back fence line that afternoon with Gina and a man she did not recognize, a heavy-set man in work pants carrying a clipboard. The 3 of them had been in the yard for about 20 minutes, walking the perimeter, the man with the clipboard occasionally making notes or gestures toward the trees. I said, "When was this?" She said, "About 2 this afternoon. Your car was gone. The botanical garden." I had been at the botanical garden. I go on the last Sunday of every month. I have done this for 11 years. Derek knew this. I thanked Noonie and sat for a while after the call in the chair by the kitchen window, looking at the back garden in the September dusk. The magnolia was still, its crown dark against the sky. I thought about the man with the clipboard. I thought about the fact that Derek had a key to the back gate, given years ago so he could put things in the garage without needing to come through the house, and that the uses to which that key had been put had expanded, incrementally and without conversation, to include bringing other people into my yard while I was not at home. I should have called Derek that evening. I know this. I am a direct person in most circumstances. I was a teacher, which requires a tolerance for direct conversation that most professions do not, and I have spent my life generally saying the thing rather than walking around it. But there are moments when clarity costs more than you want to spend in that particular hour, and I told myself I was gathering information, and that was true. But I was also doing the thing I had been doing for 18 months. Extending one more day of benefit of the doubt, because extending it was easier than not extending it. Some things don't grow back. But I was still standing in the September garden, holding the possibility that I had misread what the clipboard meant. I went to bed without calling Derek. The magnolia stood in the dark outside my window. I looked at it before I turned out the light. I came downstairs at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in October, the way I always do. Same time, same order, same deliberate routine that I have maintained since Warren died, because a routine is a thing you can stand on when other things shift. The kitchen was ordinary in every detail. The blue tile counter, the African violet on the sill that has bloomed continuously for 30 years without any particular effort on my part. The Chemex I make coffee in every morning because it requires attention, and I find that steadying. I turned the burner on under the kettle and looked out the kitchen window toward the back garden. The crown of the magnolia was not there. I stood at the window for a moment that felt much longer than it was, trying to understand what I was seeing. There was sky where the crown should have been. Just sky. Pale October sky. Flat and ordinary. I looked left to where the river birches should have been. Sky. I looked to the back fence line. The fence was visible, unobstructed, and the sky behind it was visible, and everything was visible that should not have been visible. I went to the back door and stepped outside in my house slippers. The air smelled of cut wood. That green, raw smell, sharp and wrong in the way that smells are wrong when they belong to something that should not have happened. Sawdust on the ground, pale against the October grass. The crew had been thorough and professional. 6 stumps leveled to the ground where the crepe myrtles had been, their rings still light-colored and damp. 2 birch stumps, smaller, the white papery bark still present along their lower inches. The persimmon in the corner by the south fence, cut to knee height. The wood at the center still holding some green. And in the southeast corner, where the magnolia had been for 52 years, a stump 18 inches across, pale heartwood, the rings close together the way they are in old trees, a life recorded in concentric circles. A crew was loading the last of the brush into a truck parked in the alley. Derek was standing near the garage door in a pair of new work gloves, the stiff, clean kind you buy specifically for a project you want to look prepared for. He saw me come out and raised a hand, his expression open and untroubled. "Morning, Mom," he said, and he sounded pleased, the same uncomplicated pleasure he had shown when he first drove the Tucson over. "I wanted to get it done before you had to watch the whole thing. Figured this way is easier. Look how much light you've got back here now. It changes everything. And there's finally room for the car off the street." He gestured at the open space the way a man presents a gift. Gina thought this would really open the yard up. Better for you, too. So much less to maintain. I looked at the stump in the southeast corner. 18 inches across. Pale heartwood. 52 years of rings. Warren had held the root ball while I backfilled the soil. I had watched it bloom every March. I had stood at this window and watched it bloom every March for 41 years, and now I was standing next to what remained of it in my house slippers in the October morning. I did not speak to Derek. I stood next to the stump for a time I did not measure. Then I went back inside. I measured the coffee. 6 level tablespoons, the same as every morning, and poured the water and waited. When the Chemex was done, I poured it into the stoneware mug I have used every morning for 15 years, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I held the mug in both hands, and I looked at the wall, and I was quiet inside, in a way that had nothing to do with acceptance or peace. It was more like the stillness that comes when the last uncertain thing has become certain. When you have been wondering about something for a long time, and you no longer have to wonder. I sat there until the coffee was cold. Then I made a fresh cup, and I began making calls. He did it at dawn with a hired crew while she was asleep. Used her key, cut down 52 years of her life, and then stood there telling her it was for her benefit. Standing in Loretta's slippers at that stump. What would you have done next? I called Noonie first. She answered on the second ring, and before I had said anything more than her name, she said, "I saw." She had been on her porch when the truck arrived at 5:45 that morning. She had called me 4 times. I had not heard the phone. "Loretta," she said, just my name, the way she says it when she means something that cannot be adequately said. I told her I would not be at our Thursday walk this week. She said, "I'll bring fig preserves Friday." I said, "Thank you, Noonie." That was the whole conversation we needed to have. Then I called Sylvia Kerrigan. Sylvia has handled my legal affairs for 12 years. She drew up my will after Warren died and reviewed it twice since. Once when Renee moved to Charlotte, once when Derek came back to Atlanta 18 months ago, and I added some language to the deed as what I had called at the time a precaution. That precaution looked, this morning, less like caution and more like foreknowledge I had been unwilling to act on. Sylvia's assistant put me through within 10 minutes, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about Sylvia's practice. She does not make you wait when you have indicated it is important. I told her what had happened. Factually, in sequence, the way I would have described something to a colleague: the trees, the stump, the crew, the new work gloves, what Derek had said. Then I told her about the ledger. I told her the total. I told her what I wanted to do. Sylvia listened. When I finished, she said, "Are you sure?" "Yes." I did not hesitate, and the absence of hesitation was itself information. I had been deliberating something for months, and when the moment of clarity arrived, I discovered there was nothing left to deliberate. When you have been asking yourself a question for a long time and the answer finally arrives, you do not feel doubt. You feel the absence of doubt, which is a different thing entirely. Clean and final, like a calculation that has come out even. Sylvia said she could have the will revision drafted by end of business. The deed modification would take a county filing. Paperwork ready today. Official recording in 3 to 5 business days. She asked once more if I wanted to speak with Derek before proceeding. I said no. She picked up her pen, and we began. We worked for just under 2 hours. I read everything before I signed it, every page, every clause. I asked 2 questions about the deed language that she answered clearly. When it was done, she walked me through the copies, organized them into their folders, and told me what would happen next in what order. She walked me to the door. "It's not the most common choice," she said, at the threshold. "Carefully, not a judgment." "I know," I said. "Most people wait until they are more certain." I have been certain for longer than I acted on it. I drove home in the late afternoon light with the paperwork on the passenger seat, and I thought about Warren, the way I do sometimes, after something large has happened. Not with grief, not exactly, but with the awareness of navigating something alone that we would have done together, and that aloneness is simply the fact of it now and not a wound. I thought he would have been angry on my behalf, and I understood that my not being angry was not indifference to what had been lost. It was that I was done. There is a difference between those two things, and knowing the difference has taken me most of my life. Sylvia Kerrigan's office is in a low brick building on Commerce Drive that has been there since the mid-70s. The waiting room has copies of Georgia Quarterly going back to 2013, and a receptionist named Carolyn, who has worked the front desk for at least as long as I have been a client, and who offered me water without being asked, and who looked at my face and did not comment on what she saw there, which I appreciated. The will revision was the primary instrument. The portion designated for Derek, the larger share of the house and savings, removed in full, redistributed to Renee, and to the endowment I had already established at Sequoia High School's science department, a modest annual amount that has paid for equipment and field trips for 6 years, and that I had set up quietly, without telling anyone, because it seemed like the right use of what I had. Sylvia had the language for all of it. She is thorough in the way that good attorneys are thorough, not unnecessarily elaborate, not cutting corners, just complete. The deed modification. Derek's name removed from the property record. Both actions clean, documented, filed, permanent. I want to describe the feeling of signing those documents correctly, because I have seen stories like this told as though the decisive action is a form of release, a door slamming, an unburdening. It was not like that. It was more like the feeling at the end of a school year when the final grade records were complete and submitted and accurate, and there was nothing left to do but close the file. Correct. Finished. The work itself was not triumphant. It was simply done. Sylvia walked me through every page. I asked my 2 questions. One about the language governing the deed transfer timeline, one about whether the will revision would need to be re-witnessed. And she answered both clearly and without making me feel that the questions were small. This is one of the things I have always valued about her practice. She does not condescend to precision. When we were done, she organized the copies into their folders, labeled each one in her neat hand, and set them in front of me in order. I put them in my briefcase. Carolyn at the front desk handed me my coat. "It's not the most common choice," Sylvia said at the threshold. Carefully, not a judgment. "I know," I said. "Most people wait until they are more certain. I have been certain for longer than I acted on it." I drove home in the October dusk with the paperwork on the passenger seat, and I thought about Warren, the way I do sometimes after something large has happened. Not with grief, not exactly, but with the awareness of navigating something alone that we would have done together, and that aloneness is simply the fact of it now, and not a wound. I thought he would have been angry on my behalf, and I understood that my not being angry was not indifference to what had been lost. It was that I was done. There is a difference between those 2 things, and knowing the difference has taken me most of my life. Renee called that evening. I had texted her in the afternoon, brief, factual. "Call me when you have a minute. Something happened." She called at 8:15, which was 40 minutes after I had sent the message, and the 40 minutes told me she had been watching her phone and deciding when. I told her everything in the order it had happened. Renee is 52 years old. She lives in Charlotte, works in hospital administration, calls every Sunday with a consistency that I have come to rely on in the way you rely on something that is simply there. She has been watching Derek's behavior since he came back to Atlanta. Quietly, from a geographic distance, she has kept deliberately, with the careful neutrality of a person who learned long ago that her mother does things in her own time. She had not said anything to me directly about Derek in 18 months. She did not need to. I could hear what she was not saying in the quality of the Sunday calls, and I understood the restraint of it, and I was grateful for it without telling her so. When I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. "Good," she said. One word, exactly sufficient. I had not known until that moment that I was waiting to hear how she would receive it, and when I heard it, I exhaled in a way that I had apparently needed to exhale for some time. We talked for nearly an hour after that. Practical things. Whether I wanted her to come down, what would happen when Derek received the paperwork, whether I had eaten dinner. I told her I had made eggs. She said, "Actual eggs or toast again?" And I said eggs and toast, and she said, "I'll let that count." She asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and meant it. Not all right in the sense of undamaged, but all right in the sense of having done the accurate thing and having been certain about it, which is a specific kind of all right that does not require explanation. I asked if she was surprised. She said, "About the trees? Yes. That's a new low, even for him." A pause. "About what you did?" "Not even a little bit." After we hung up, I sat at the table for a while, without turning off the kitchen lights. I thought about Renee as a small girl in this house, she and the magnolia the same age, both growing up in this yard, and the way I had watched them both. I thought about Warren at the kitchen window saying, I guess it worked. I thought about the fact that he was gone, and the tree was gone, and there was nothing in the southeast corner of the garden now but a stump 18 inches across and the October sky above it. None of this was self-pity. It was inventory, the kind you do when the event is over and you are accounting for what remains. What remained was this house, this yard, this garden, this kitchen, and the African violet on the sill, and the stoneware mug. And Renee in Charlotte, who would drive down if I asked, and Noonie next door with her fig, preserves, and her 31 years of paying attention. That is not a small inventory. I recognized it for what it was. The paperwork arrived by certified mail on a Thursday. Noonie saw the postal truck from her porch and called me. I had been walking the backyard in the early morning the way I had been doing each day that week, not gardening exactly, just moving through the altered space, getting used to its new dimensions. There was more afternoon sun than I had seen back there in years. The persimmon stump had already put out 2 suckers from the root system, small and green and insistent. Native persimmon will do this. The root system does not know that the trunk is gone. It keeps sending up new growth, trying. The suckers would never be the persimmon I had planted in 1998. But they were alive, and they knew what they were trying to become. Derek called on Friday afternoon. He had spoken to someone before he called, a lawyer friend or a colleague, because the conversation did not begin with the tone of a man reacting. It began with the careful, slightly stiffened tone of a man who has been coached to stay measured. He said he had received something in the mail and wanted to understand what he had done to deserve this. I listened to deserve. I thought about the word. Deserve positions the whole thing as punishment, as though what I had done was something inflicted on him in response to his behavior, rather than a decision I had made about my own affairs. I did not say this. I said, "You knew what those trees were." He was quiet. Then he said the trees were just trees, that he had done it to reduce my maintenance burden, to give me more light, to help. He said it in the register he always used, the register of a man who has genuinely arranged his perspective so that his convenience and your well-being always converge, who cannot see the seam where they separate, who would describe himself as a thoughtful person and believe it. He was not lying to me. He was, as he had always been, lying to himself, which is the harder version of the thing to sit across from. He said, "Mom, Gina and I have been talking about being around more, helping more. I thought this was the beginning of that." I said, "Derek." He stopped. I said, "You used my key to access my property while I was not home. You hired a crew without asking me. You cut down a tree your father planted. You have borrowed close to $20,000 and made no payment, and no mention of any payment. I am not angry. I am clear. There was a long silence. Then, quietly, he said, Dad would have hated this. I thought about Warren. His chair on the porch, a Louis L'Amour novel open face down on the armrest, the shade of the magnolia. He would have. You're right, I said. He would have. Derek said he was sorry, more than once, and with an increasing sincerity that came from underneath the coached tone, and was real. I believed it was real. But it was the kind of sorry that is still, at its center, more about what he had lost than about what I had lost, which is the limit of it. He could feel the loss of the inheritance, the loss of the relationship as it had been. He could not quite reach the stump in the southeast corner, not yet. Perhaps not ever. Almost remorse. I held it exactly as large as it was, which was real and insufficient. And I said, I know you are. I meant it. I did not change anything. The weeks after the paperwork arrived were quieter than I had expected, and the quiet was not unpleasant. The Sunday dinners stopped, not by announcement or declared decision, but by the natural cessation of things that have lost their occasion. Derek did not call to cancel. The calls simply became less frequent, and then infrequent, and then occasional, the way water finds a lower level. Gina did not come to the house. The 6 storage bins remained in the garage for 3 weeks, and then, one Wednesday afternoon while I was at the botanical garden, Derek came and took them. He left the garage in exactly the state he had found it, which I noticed when I came home. The shelves undisturbed, my supplies in their places, the Felco pruners on their hooks in their order. He was capable of that consideration. I noted it accurately, the way I noted all of it. Noonie came on Friday with the preserves, as she had said she would. 2 ball jars in a paper bag, the fig kind, which is the best of her preserves, and the one she gives to the shortest list. She sat on the porch with me for 2 hours and a half, and did not fill the silence unnecessarily, which is the mark of a friend who has been paying attention for a long time. She looked at the back garden twice without saying anything. Once, toward the end, she said, "The persimmon's already sending up suckers. Did you see?" "I saw," I said. "You could let one grow," she said. "If you wanted." I said, "Maybe." And I meant it as maybe, not as yes, because I had not decided yet about the persimmon, and I wanted to decide it honestly, rather than sentimentally. Renee came for the October weekend, the way she does each year. We raked leaves on Saturday morning, fewer than usual without the magnolia and the birches, and the reduced pile had its own particular quality of loss, quiet and cumulative. We made soup from the last of the garden herbs and watched a film on Friday evening, and on Saturday afternoon, Renee helped me move Warren's green Adirondack chair from the southeast corner of the porch to the other side, near the garden gate. I had been meaning to move it for some time. It had sat facing the southeast corner for 9 years, since Warren died, and there was nothing in that corner now worth facing. We put it by the gate, where the Japanese maple at the front of the yard was going into its full fall color, coral and amber. "Better," Renee said. I agreed, and meant it. On Sunday morning before she left, she asked if I missed Derek. I took the question seriously, the way she meant it. "I miss what I believed was there," I said. "That's a different kind of missing." She drove back to Charlotte at noon. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 9 years, which is the quiet of a house that belongs to one person and is arranged around that person's life. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked out the back window, and I thought, for the first time since October, about what I wanted to put back in that garden. Not to restore what had been there. That was not possible, and I was not interested in pretending otherwise. But the yard was mine, and it was open, and it was, in a way I had not expected, full of room. I went to the nursery on a Saturday morning in November. Cherokee native plants on Lawrenceville Highway. I have been coming here since 1994, the year I took the river birch cuttings, and Ramona at the counter knows what I grow and how I grow it, and does not try to redirect me toward ornamentals because they would look nice. It was properly cold that morning, Georgia November working at its full authority, the sky a flat gray, and the air carrying the smell of leaf decay and frost coming. I had my canvas bag and my list, and I was there for one specific thing. Ramona had 2 saucer magnolias left in stock. She said they had ordered more than they sold that season, and these 2 had been sitting since September. One was leggy, reaching toward a light it couldn't find in its corner of the greenhouse. The other was compact and self-contained, 3 years old, 18 inches tall, with the shape that a young Magnolia ex Sulanjana has when it knows what it is going to become. A little dense at the crown, its energy gathered rather than extended. I stood in front of it for longer than I needed to. "That one's a good one," Ramona said behind me. "Yes," I said. I paid $42 and loaded it into the Camry in its black nursery pot, the root ball wrapped in burlap the way Warren's had been wrapped when he brought it home, which I noted without ceremony and without making more of it than it was. I drove home. I did not go to the southeast corner. I had thought about this and decided. You cannot replace a 52-year-old tree. You do not try. What you can do is choose where to put something new, and the choosing matters as its own act, not as consolation but as placement, as the accurate assessment of where a thing will have room and what light it will need. I chose the northwest corner, morning light from 6 until noon, afternoon shade, correct for saucer magnolia. The southeast corner with its new unobstructed afternoon sun would have been too much. I dug the hole to 18 inches, amended the soil with compost and a cup of hollytone, set the root ball in carefully, backfilled in layers, tamped gently with my heel, watered it slowly. I did all of this without ceremony or audience, the way I do things that matter, methodically, correctly, with full attention. When it was done, I stood up and looked at it. 18 inches tall, 3 years old. It would not bloom for another 2 years, possibly 3. It would take a decade to show its full shape. It would be at its best long after I am here to see it, and the thought of that did not make me sad. Warren planted his magnolia at the height of his life, and he did not live to see it at 40 feet. That is what you do when you plant a long-lived tree. You give it to the future, to whoever tends this yard after you. The yard will have a magnolia. That seemed right and accurate and sufficient. I went inside and made coffee in the Chemex and carried my mug to the kitchen window. The back garden was bright and open, still strange in its openness after a month of looking at it. The persimmon stumps had 3 suckers now, small and determined. In the northwest corner, there was one small new thing, 18 inches tall, its last few leaves bronze orange in the November light, its shape gathered and self-contained and entirely unhurried. Not a replacement, not a consolation, a beginning in a spot I had chosen, in a corner that now had room. Some things don't grow back. That is the accurate, botanical, final statement. Root systems that have been destroyed do not regenerate at the same depth. 52 years cannot be replanted. What was between Derek and me, whatever it was, and I have looked at it clearly enough to know what it was. I know the difference between dormant and dead, and I have made the accurate assessment. But some things, if you choose where to put them, have room now that they didn't have before. I drank my coffee. The sapling stood in its corner in the November light. The yard was quiet and entirely mine. No argument, no tears, no long explanation. Just a phone call and a new sapling in a corner she chose herself. Honestly, I'd have done the same. Only I might not have waited as long as she did. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and leave a comment below. It's what keeps this channel alive.